Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today we're obviously celebrating International Nurses Day, and it's an interesting one because people often say, why did they choose the 12th of May? Well, the simple answer is it's the birthday of Florence Nightingale. And if you remember a few weeks ago, and I would recommend you look it up, we did a video and we had one of the Scutari nurses sat in this very seat here, which was meant to be obviously the Crimea, or back in London after the Crimean War. But if anyone follows our Facebook and Twitter and even our Instagram, I sort of put a question on today, which was, whose birthday is it today? And so far, we've had several people write Florence Nightingale, because obviously they know that today's the day. But what people don't realise is it's actually Helen's birthday. Helen, happy birthday. It's her birthday today, and an interesting fact, she was almost named Florence because of obviously the link with Florence Nightingale's birthday. Anyway, luckily, Helen wasn't born way back in the 1800s. She was born, and I'm not going to say it. Anyway, I was writing out cards recently. There's the little card that I wrote out for Helen. And when I was writing the card out, I suddenly had an idea. We could do a video on pens. Now, some people think that would be the most boringest talk I have ever heard. Some people say, come on, you can't talk about pencils, for example. They'd be saying there's a pencil museum next. Well, actually, there is a pencil museum. It's up north in the Lake District. I think it's in Keswick, I think it is, which is worth having a look at. So believe it or not, pens, pencils, even the things that we use, for example, toilet paper and soap, they all have interesting histories. I never look at something and just think that's a glass, that's a bottle. I always think, who was the first person to use those objects? So in today's video, we are celebrating obviously the International Nurses Day. We're also celebrating Helen's birthday, but I've also decided to look at pens. Now, pens today are something that we often find, pick up. Some people buy them. There must be a lot of people buying them. And most pens are like this one here, a biro. I will add, this is actually quite a special pen, because this is a pen that we were given from Karor. And Karor is a fantastic bed and breakfast on Hadrian's Wall. And after lockdown, if you get a chance, go there. Their pens are absolutely fantastic, because not only does it have their details on it, it actually says on it, I've slept on Hadrian's Wall. And the interesting fact is, the B&B is actually based on Hadrian's Wall. So when you go to sleep in that bed and breakfast, you are literally on Hadrian's Wall. So we pick up pens all the time, and I'm sure you may be sat there now with a pen in hand, for example, or you know there's a drawer in your house with several pens in. You may even have one in a flower pot. They are everywhere. Pens are absolutely everywhere. Now, the first time we start writing, or actually doing something art-wise as such, is actually way back in the Stone Age, and they would have used something like this. And what that actually is a twig that they've chewed on the end. In other words, they've splintered it down like that, and that could be used as a very early makeshift paintbrush to actually put pictures and so on, for example, on cave walls. So that's probably the first, shall we say, writing device in history. But we actually go a long way from that to something like that. So we have lots and lots of props that we use for our talks and our school workshops and so on. And we have props for every age, and generally we cover every age from the Stone Age to the 1950s. So if someone said to me, can you talk about the history of plates, I can get all the plates out that I own from the Stone Age to the 1950s. If someone said, can you get swords out from any age from the Stone Age to the 1950s, we'll be able to do that as well. But I have brought some of my pens in. So that's our first and earliest writing device that we've got. When you get to the ancient times, as such really, when we're starting to be a bit more complicated with our language and writing, pens actually change. Now, this is a pen that I use when we do ancient work, really, just to show them the sort of pens that people were writing with. We know Romans wrote with pens like that, the ancient Egyptians did, and the ancient Greeks also. And this would have been made out of a reed. So what you do is you take the reed from along the riverside, and it's cut at a certain angle, and you would have wrote using a very simple ink, and it's literally a dip pen, which you will see there's a bit of a trend with this. You will get lots of dip pens until really we get reservoirs built into the pen. We then have this. This is a fantastic pen that I've used before, and that is a pen that's based on one found on Hadrian's Wall, and it's a typical dip pen but with an iron nib, and these have been found by archaeologists, the actual nibs here. So once again, you would dip it into the ink, dipping the pen in and writing with it on your paper. We could look at paper as a separate topic, believe it or not. But then eventually, when we start getting to the Anglo-Saxon period, the Normans, what we used to call the Dark Ages, what we now call the early medieval, and then the high medieval, the most iconic pen that's being used is one of these, famously the quill. It's funny though, because most people, especially the scholars and the religious people in the Middle Ages, they used to call this a pen. And people often say, well, where does the word pen come from? It actually comes from the fact that the Latin word for feather or even wing or flight tip is actually penna. Penna is Latin. So you can see why we use the word pen when we look at the old medieval word, the Latin word for a writing device. And you can make these yourselves. A bit of advice if you are going for your healthy walk, and remember now you can do more than one walk a day. If you go anywhere near the river or even a lake or somewhere like that, if you find a swan feather, or more importantly, and this was more common, the goose feather, they're really good. Pick some up, and then at some point when you get home, get a parent to help you make a pen. Maybe that would be a separate video, but briefly, all you're going to do is slice it at an angle like you would look at any other pen. So you've got the pointy bit and then a slope down from it. Scrape out the insides because there's some very, very fine feathery down inside the quill, and then chisel the end, split it, and you've actually got a quill, a pen. The type of pen that from the medieval period all the way through history we were writing with. Don't leave all the feathers on. Most medieval people took them off, most of the time just leaving a specific shape or maybe removing one side, and that was to personalise it. So when you put your pen down, you would know whose pen is whose. Good bit of a tip for you. It's the equivalent of writing your name on a pen or having a pen with your name printed on it. But like I said, those pens, the penna, as the Latin word is, continued for a very, very long time when writing started to take off in large amounts. But then eventually, when you get to the 18th century, they're actually shortening the quill. So there we go, it's a shortened quill, but it's still being used as a pen. There's no point in having this big feathery thing anymore, and people would use these for writing into books, for example, if they were in accountancy, for example. And that's the thing to remember. By the 18th century, we're into relatively modern living. Then what comes along when you get to the 1800s, and more importantly in the Victorian era, is you have a wooden version of the quill. So there we have our goose feather cut down, and this time we're having wood. So in a way, it's gone back to the Roman in ancient pens. We've got woodwork being used again. The only difference now is the quill, the tip, the nib as such, has been made out of some fine metalwork. But what you will notice is these pens are identical to the early pens. You have to dip them. In the Victorian era, these were commonly known as dip pens. And I'm sure people that are watching this, for example, remembers a dip pen. Now, that's not saying that you're from the Victorian era, But even into the 1950s, that was your standard pen for a lot of school children. I hear lots of stories about people volunteering or maybe getting picked to be an ink monitor, where you would take the bottles of ink, take the lid off, you gather in all the inkwells from the desk, pour the ink in, and then pop them on people's desks. A very, very important job in school years ago, an ink monitor. I do hear about scary, horrible stories where some children rolled up paper, dipped it in the ink, and then flicked it across the room. Or even worse, I've heard about girls sat in front of boys, and when they've got long hair in plaits, for example, the boys would lean forward, take the hair, and dip it in the ink. So it would have been a lot of people with tie-dyed hair as such in the past, especially in the 30s, 40s and 50s. So these pens have been around for a long time, but it's a dip pen, as all pens were, for years and years and years. You do get a few mechanical pens, shall we say, really being used. For example, by the Victorian era, late Victorian into the Edwardian, you get the typewriter coming in, which later leads on to the computer. So we're doing less writing as such. This is a pen from the 1930s. This one is made out of Bakelite. So this is from sort of the war period, about 75, 80 years ago. People were in school still writing with those. But eventually, the most common pen that you find in the 50s and 60s, and even when I was at school, is the fountain pen. This is actually quite an early fountain pen, because when you open it, what you have in here is a small rubber reservoir, and what you have to do is you carry your ink with you, there we go, and you squeeze it, you suck up the ink, and then all you need to do then is pop the pen back together, and you can start writing straight away with it. So you're sucking up your own ink with it. Eventually they go to cartridges. When I was at school, I remember having cartridges on a pen, and I love fountain pens because it writes really, really neat. But then eventually, after all that, with the typewriter still being used, eventually the computer comes along. Obviously much bigger than this one, but eventually you start getting the laptop. You also then go on to having the netbook, the smaller ones, even the tablet. And now most things that you want to do, you can get a Word document, for example, can be written straight onto your mobile phone. Or, and until recently, I've even managed, because it was gifted to me, a watch, which you can also find, you get emails and that on. So it's an amazing thing really, how we start way back in time when we start doing pictures on cave walls, and then eventually end up with something that you can have on your wrist and speak to the world from it. It's quite an amazing thing. So on that note, I wish Helen a happy birthday. I wish Florence Nightingale a happy birthday, and a happy birthday for anyone out there that's listening that's also sharing a birthday with Helen and Florence. On that note, stay safe everyone, and we'll see you soon.